They put me at the kids' table. That was the first thing I saw when I found my name on the seating chart. And for a second, I thought it was a mistake. I had arrived early, suit pressed, tie straight, ready to celebrate my niece's wedding, thinking I'd take my place near the family table, close enough to share smiles, clink glasses, and maybe offer a toast. But my name wasn't there. It was tucked far into the bottom corner of the reception board, beside a cluster of names half my age. Table 14. Kids. At first I laughed under my breath, telling myself it must be some quirky joke, a playful oversight that would be corrected when someone noticed. But as I followed the neatly arranged rows of tables in the grand ballroom, the truth settled like a cold draft under my collar. This was intentional. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, the murmur of guests filling the air like static. On one side, the family table was set like a throne, white linens, crystal glasses catching the light, a place of honor, right under the floral arch. On the other, in the far corner, I could just make out my seat. A round table with paper napkins, plastic cups, and a little box of crayons in the center. It's strange how quickly pride can turn to shame. A moment earlier, I had been walking in with my head high, ready to embrace a day of joy. Now, each step toward that corner table felt like a walk of humiliation, the kind where every guest's glance lasts half a second too long, and you can hear the silent question in their eyes. Why is he over there? The laughter from the main table rang louder than the music, sharper than the clink of glasses, as if mocking the thought that I'd ever belong in their circle. I pulled out the small chair, a lightweight thing, more fit for a school cafeteria than a wedding, and sat down. Around me, children kicked their legs, swinging them under the table, coloring in cartoon animals and spilling juice boxes. They were sweet, innocent, oblivious. But I wasn't. My eyes kept drifting back across the room to where my sister sat, leaning in close to her husband. She glanced in my direction once, quickly enough to pretend she hadn't, and when he whispered something to her, they both laughed. That laugh stuck to my ribs. It wasn't just a bad seat. It was a message, and though no one said it out loud, I could hear it clearly enough in the scrape of my chair, the way no one noticed I'd arrived, the deliberate distance between me and the people I had come to celebrate. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please, write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever had something like this happen in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now we continue. I didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, they'd remember exactly who paid for their feast, and they wouldn't be laughing then. Plastic cups, coloring books, chicken tenders served on small white plates that looked more like cafeteria trays than part of a wedding celebration. The centerpiece wasn't flowers or candles. It was a little basket of crayons, some already broken in half. Around me the children laughed, their faces smeared with ketchup, their feet swinging beneath chairs too tall for them. They had no idea I wasn't supposed to be here. To them, I was just another adult sitting nearby, maybe an uncle who liked to watch them draw. But I knew exactly where I was, and more importantly, where I wasn't. Across the room, the main table shimmered like another world. Crystal glasses caught the light, polished silverware reflected soft candle flames, and wine flowed into tall stems that clinked gently every time someone made a toast. Their chairs formed a perfect arc around the couple, angled inward, a fortress of laughter and exclusivity. I could see the backs of their heads, the way they leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices I couldn't hear. Every so often, one of them would glance toward my corner, just a flicker, just enough for our eyes to meet before they turned back to their conversations. And in that fleeting look, I could read it all. Amusement, dismissal, maybe even satisfaction. It was the kind of glance that says, "We put you there on purpose." The music played on, a soft melody overlaid with the steady hum of adult conversation. I lifted the plastic cup in front of me, the kind that bent slightly if you gripped it too hard, and sipped the watered-down soda I'd been given. Across the room, wine swirled deep red in glass bowls, catching glimmers of gold from the chandeliers. My fingers traced the rim of the cup, feeling the cheapness of it, the deliberate difference. The laughter at the family table wasn't the same as the giggles around me. The kids laughed freely, spilling juice, knocking over crayons without shame. The adults laughed with that sharp, knowing tone, the kind of laugh that has edges, that carries a hint of judgment beneath its surface. I sat there, pretending not to notice, but every note of it reached me, each one a reminder that I had been placed outside the circle. And yet, the more I watched them, the more something inside me shifted. I remembered the phone call months ago, the panic in their voices when the catering deposit needed to be paid immediately. I had stepped in without hesitation, wiring the money as if it were nothing, certain that my help would be met with gratitude. But gratitude, I realize now, has a short memory when pride gets in the way. So I sat, smiling faintly when the children showed me their drawings, nodding when they asked if I liked the cake. But inside, a different picture was forming, one that had nothing to do with crayons. I didn't yet know the details, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be leaving this wedding empty-handed, not after what they'd made so clear. I caught my sister's glance, brief, almost reluctant, like a thread pulled tight and quickly cut. For a heartbeat, something passed across her face, not warmth, not joy, something closer to guilt. But just as quickly, it was smoothed away, replaced with the kind of smile people wear when they want everyone else to believe nothing is wrong. A performance for anyone watching. For me, it was worse than no expression at all. Her husband leaned in, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and said something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. The way her lips curved into a small, complicit grin told me enough. Then came the laugh. Short, controlled, but edged with that unkind sharpness people try to hide behind politeness. They didn't look my way again, not directly, but I could feel their awareness of me in the way they leaned toward the others at their table, in the way their hands gestured toward the center of the conversation, as though protecting it from any intrusion. I looked down at my paper napkin. It was folded into a sloppy rectangle, the kind you get when the staff knows the table is for children and doesn't expect anyone to notice the difference. The fabric napkins over there, at the family table, were folded into elegant fans, tucked into crystal glasses, untouched by the grease of chicken tenders or the sticky sweetness of juice boxes. I smoothed my palm over the paper one, feeling its thinness give under my hand. The hum of the room pressed in around me, bursts of laughter from the main table, the clinking of silver on porcelain, the occasional scrape of a chair leg as someone stood to greet another guest. My own table was quieter now, the children absorbed in their coloring pages, their laughter softer, their energy momentarily contained. That contrast, the quiet in my corner and the boisterous comfort of the other side of the room, felt like a map of my place in this family. I told myself to let it go, to enjoy the evening, to ignore the sting. But the truth is, some things don't slide off as easily as we wish. The smallest gestures, a glance, a whisper, a laugh shared at your expense, can root themselves deep, growing into something far heavier than they appear. And as I sat there, my gaze fixed on the napkin in my lap, the weight of it all began to settle. It wasn't just the table. It wasn't just tonight. It was the accumulation of every little decision, every subtle dismissal, every unspoken reminder that I wasn't quite part of the circle anymore. They'd made their choice about where I belonged, and I was beginning to realize I'd have to make mine. When the DJ's voice announced it was time for the speeches, a ripple of attention spread across the room. Guests turned their chairs, glasses were refilled, and the hum of conversation softened into a polite hush. I sat up a little straighter, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and warmth I always carried before speaking in front of people I cared about. In my pocket was a small folded card, the one I'd been jotting notes on for weeks. A few short lines, nothing grand, but enough to remind my niece how proud I was of her, how deeply I wished her happiness in the years ahead. I watched as the first speaker stood, the groom's best man, with his easy grin and practiced charm. His words drew scattered laughter, then a wave of applause. The maid of honor followed, her voice trembling with emotion, her anecdotes pulling smiles and even a few tears from the crowd. After her came the father of the bride, whose toast carried the weight of tradition, every sentence polished and proper. I waited. One name after another was called: a cousin, an old friend, the groom's uncle, who spoke for too long but was met with indulgent smiles. My sister stood briefly to thank the guests and the vendors. Still, no one looked toward my table. I felt the cool condensation from my untouched soda seeping into my palm. Across the room, crystal glasses were raised high, catching the warm light as though each toast belonged to some shared golden moment. My own glass sat low, the plastic dull and fogged, my drink still fizzing quietly against the ice. When the final speaker finished, the room erupted into applause. The DJ turned the music back up, an upbeat love song that seemed almost cruel in its timing. My card stayed in my pocket. My voice stayed in my throat, unspoken words pressing against my chest. I tried to swallow them, but they didn't go down easily. They stayed there, a lump I couldn't dislodge, heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't a simple oversight. I glanced toward the family table one last time. My sister was laughing again, leaning in close to someone beside her, as if the night was unfolding exactly as it should. My absence from that list of speakers hadn't been a mistake. It had been part of the design, the kind of choice that didn't need to be explained because it was meant to be understood without words. And I did understand. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just excluded from a toast. I was excluded from a place where my voice was meant to matter. And that kind of silence doesn't just sting. It changes something in you. It makes you decide how much longer you're willing to sit quietly. The applause from the last toast still lingered in the air when the photographer's voice cut through the music, calling the couple toward the cake. Guests gathered in a semicircle, phones raised, flashes catching on sequins and crystal. I stayed seated, my view of the towering confection half blocked by the backs of chairs. The cake was a masterpiece. 4 tiers of sugar and craft, wrapped in delicate fondant flowers and crowned with a spray of gold leaves. It stood there like a monument to celebration, to excess, to everything they had chosen to prioritize tonight. And as I watched them pose, his hand on hers, the knife poised just so, my mind slipped away from the present. 6 months earlier, the scene had been far less polished. I'd been home, a quiet evening, when my phone rang. My sister's voice carried a sharpness I recognized instantly. That blend of urgency and expectation. They'd run into a problem. The venue needed the catering deposit that week or the date would be lost. The number she named wasn't small, the kind of sum most people would have to plan for. But I didn't hesitate. There hadn't been a question in my mind back then. Family needed help. I had the means, and so I wired the money that same night. No conditions, no contract, just trust, the unspoken belief that my contribution would be acknowledged, if not in grand gestures, then at least in quiet respect. I'd hung up the phone feeling oddly proud, not because I had given them something, but because I'd been able to step in when it mattered. That's what family was for, I told myself. Now, as I sat in the corner of that ballroom, watching the sparkle of the cake knife in the photographer's lens, that memory felt like a different lifetime. No one here would have guessed that the feast laid out before them, the steaming trays of roast, the towers of appetizers, the endless line of desserts, had been secured because of that moment months ago. No one had mentioned it in a toast. No one had so much as nodded in my direction when the food was praised. The knife slid into the cake, applause broke out, and I realized the applause wasn't for me. It never had been. The deposit, the gesture, the trust. It had all vanished into the air like it had never happened, replaced with something else entirely. Something colder. It's a strange kind of pain. Watching people you've supported build their celebration on the foundation you quietly provided, while pretending that foundation doesn't exist. It doesn't shout. It doesn't break plates or flip tables. It just sits there, invisible and undeniable, until you decide whether you're willing to let it stay that way. And in that moment, staring at the cake I'd helped pay for, I felt the first real crack of that trust. Not loud, not obvious, but deep enough to reach the part of me that keeps score, even when I wish it didn't. "Don't worry," my sister had said that night. her voice soft but hurried, as if she didn't want to linger too long on the subject. "You'll be taken care of." I can still hear those words, the way they seem to carry a promise of inclusion, of recognition, of something warm waiting on the other side of my help. I remember the way I smiled then, thinking she meant what I thought she meant, that my support would be met with gratitude, that I would be given a place not just at their table, but in their story. Back then, I didn't think to question it. I didn't press for details or ask what taken care of actually meant. Why would I? She was my sister, and family doesn't require fine print. You believe them. You believe the tone of their voice more than the literal meaning of their words. I had imagined the future from that point forward. Not lavish thank yous, or my name etched into the wedding program, but something simpler. A seat where the family sat. A toast that might not mention the money but would still wrap me in belonging. I expected to feel part of it all. Now, sitting under the shadow of the floral arch that belonged to someone else's corner of the room, I began to understand that her promise had been something entirely different. Taken care of didn't mean honored. It meant placed, moved, set aside somewhere I couldn't interfere with the shine of their day. It meant keeping me out of the frame, not because there wasn't space, but because they had decided my presence didn't fit the image they wanted. I could see it so clearly now in every choice they had made. My seat far from the circle of laughter, my name absent from the list of speakers, my role in their preparations erased like chalk in the rain. Gratitude in their version of events wasn't expressed. It was implied in the fact that I had been allowed to attend at all. And there's a sting in realizing that, in their eyes, your greatest offering earns you not a place of honor, but a quiet corner and a paper napkin. The music swelled again, couples moving toward the dance floor, the bride and groom lost in the pull of their first dance. Applause erupted, faces turned toward the center, the whole room united in a moment that felt as if it had no cracks. But I knew better. I had seen what lay beneath it, the careful arranging of people and places so the day could shine the way they wanted, even if it meant dimming someone else entirely. And that's when I realized something important. Promises mean nothing without the intent behind them. She had promised I'd be taken care of. And she had kept that promise, just not in the way I had ever imagined. I had been taken care of, all right. I had been carefully placed exactly where they wanted me, out of sight, out of mind, and far away from anything that looked like the family table. It happened so quickly I almost didn't react. One of the little boys at my table reached for his cup without looking, his attention still fixed on the cartoon he was coloring. And the next thing I knew, a wave of red fruit punch tipped over the rim. It splashed across the tablecloth, ran down the side of the table, and landed squarely on the sleeve and chest of my jacket. The cold, sticky shock made me inhale sharply, but no one heard it over the music. The boy froze for a second, wide-eyed, then went back to his drawing. Children spill things. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next, or rather what didn't. No one came over. No server noticed. No family member crossed the room to check on me. The main table kept talking, eating, laughing, their conversations uninterrupted, their glasses clinking together like a chorus. Even my sister, who must have seen the commotion in the corner, didn't shift in her chair. She didn't send anyone over with a napkin or even offer a glance to see if I was all right. I sat there with the wet fabric clinging to my skin, feeling the sugary stickiness sink in. And for the first time that night, I stopped pretending. I was invisible. The children didn't care where I sat, but the adults did. They'd made sure I was placed where my absence from their table would go unnoticed. And now, my small accident was just another piece of proof that I existed outside their concern. My presence didn't register unless it served their purposes. I thought maybe the feeling would pass, that the night would move on, and I could brush it off. But then the call came for group photos. I was waved over like an afterthought, squeezed into a gap on the far edge of the family cluster. The photographer didn't adjust anyone to make space for me. He just snapped the pictures, his focus clearly on the glittering center of the arrangement. The bride, the groom, the chosen few around them. I knew before I even saw the images that my place would be cut off in the printed versions. I'd be that half-visible shoulder, the faint blur of a smile at the border of the frame, the part of the picture you notice only when someone points it out. It's a strange feeling, standing in a crowd and knowing you've already been edited out in spirit before the camera even clicks. When it was over, they drifted back to their seats, the main table glowing under the soft light, and I returned to my own. The stain on my jacket had dried into a faint crust, the faint scent of artificial fruit clinging to me. It wasn't the spill or the photo or even the distance that finally shifted something in me. It was the realization that this wasn't just a careless oversight. It was deliberate. That was the last straw. And, as I sat back down, my eyes fixed not on the dance floor, not on the cake, not on the people I'd come to celebrate, but on the quiet, irrefutable thought forming in my mind. They had no idea that the person they had worked so hard to push to the edges was the same person who had paid for the meal they were still praising. When the DJ called for everyone to join the newlyweds on the dance floor, the room erupted with movement. Chairs scraped back, heels clicked against the polished floor, and the bass from the speakers sent a low vibration through the tables. Laughter spilled into the air like champagne, loud and unbroken, filling every corner of the ballroom except the one where I sat. I watched as bodies pressed close in the center of the room, swaying under the glow of string lights, a moment choreographed for joy. I stood, but not to join them. My steps moved in the opposite direction, quiet against the carpet, carrying me toward the double doors that led to the foyer. The moment I crossed through them, the sound changed, muffled now, distant, like a memory you can hear but not quite touch. The air outside the ballroom was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax. Out here the night felt still. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone, not to scroll through messages, but to open something I hadn't looked at in months. A file sat in my saved documents, the PDF receipt from the catering company, time-stamped and stamped, paid in full. I remembered taking the screenshot the day the wire went through, not because I doubted it would be remembered, but because I wanted to keep a small token of the moment I'd stepped in to help. Back then, it had felt like something worth preserving. Now, staring at it, under the warm light of the foyer sconces, it looked different. The black and white numbers no longer carried pride. They carried weight. They carried the quiet truth that without that payment, without my intervention, the dinner they were enjoying wouldn't have existed in the form it did tonight. The roasted meats, the endless hors d'oeuvres, the artfully plated salads, all of it had been locked in place by that deposit. I scrolled slowly through the document, my thumb brushing over the line where my name sat in neat official type, right above the figure that had caused them so much panic back then. In the ballroom, the bass kicked harder, a cheer rising from the crowd. The sound of it filtered out into the hallway, almost mocking in its distance. I leaned back against the wall, the phone still in my hand, and let the truth wash over me. This wasn't just about a bad seat or a missed toast anymore. This was about the deliberate act of erasing someone's part in a story, so the picture could look cleaner, shinier, without the inconvenience of shared credit. They hadn't just excluded me from the table. They had removed me from the narrative entirely. For the first time that night, my chest felt steady, my thoughts clear. I knew exactly what I was holding in my hand. Not just a receipt, not just proof. It was leverage, quiet, indisputable, and entirely mine. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need to make a scene to be heard. I could speak in the language they understood best. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, straightened my jacket, and walked slowly back toward the ballroom doors. I didn't go inside right away. I just stood there for a moment, watching through the gap as they danced, laughing with the certainty that the night belonged to them. They had no idea that before it was over they'd remember exactly whose money had kept the music playing. I returned to my seat, but I didn't rejoin the evening. My body was in the room, yet my mind had already stepped somewhere else entirely. A place sharper, colder, where the lights and music faded into background noise. The laughter, the clinking of cutlery, the whirl of dresses on the dance floor. All of it became a muted blur while I reached into my jacket for my phone again. This time it wasn't to look at the receipt, it was to act on it. The screen lit my face in the dim corner of the room as I opened a new email. My fingers moved with a slow, deliberate steadiness, each letter clicking into place without hesitation. Subject: outstanding payment. The words looked sterile at the top of the draft, stripped of anger, stripped of wounded pride, and yet they carried more weight than any insult I could have thrown across the room. This wasn't going to be an emotional outburst. This was going to be a transaction, clean and undeniable. I began with the date of transfer, written in full, month and day. Beneath it, the exact amount I had wired 6 months earlier, down to the last cent. Then the invoice number from the catering company, copied exactly as it appeared on their letterhead. No flourish, no extra words. Facts don't need decoration. They carry their own authority. The last line took me a moment. I let my thumb hover over the keyboard before typing the simplest of terms. Payment due within 14 days. I didn't explain why I was sending it now, didn't reference the evening, didn't hint at the sting of being shoved to the edges of their celebration. They didn't need those details. If they didn't understand the timing, the reality of the figure attached to my name would be enough to make them think. Somewhere across the room, my sister was laughing again, tilting her head toward her husband in that way she always did when she wanted to look perfectly in step with him. I watched them for a second, wondering if they'd feel the shift the moment my message landed in their inbox. Maybe they wouldn't read it tonight. Maybe the shock would come tomorrow, or the day after, when the warmth of their wedding night had cooled into the ordinary rhythm of life, and then this small, precise reminder of their debt would drop into it like a stone in still water. I read the email twice, checking each line. It was short, controlled, entirely free of the heat that might betray satisfaction or hurt, and yet, beneath its surface, every word was laced with the truth they had been trying so hard to bury. I wasn't a forgotten corner at the kids' table. I was the foundation they'd been standing on all night. I saved it in drafts for a moment, my thumb resting just above the send button, feeling the strange calm of knowing that when I did press it, the real conversation would begin. One they couldn't sidestep with a laugh or a whisper. In that corner of the ballroom, surrounded by music I no longer heard, I sat still and quiet, the glowing phone in my hand. It wasn't revenge I was after, it was balance. And before this was over, the scales would tip. I stared at the draft on my phone, the words crisp and controlled on the glowing screen. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the question hang in the air between me and the device in my hand. Was this petty? A low blow thrown in the middle of what was supposed to be their happiest night? Or was it something else entirely? A quiet, measured act to restore a balance they had tipped so far out of alignment. I thought about the months since that late-night call, about the way I'd stepped in without hesitation, certain that my part in their day would be valued, even if never spoken aloud. I thought about the paper napkin in my lap, the watered-down soda in a plastic cup, the laughter across the room that had bent around me like light avoiding a shadow. I thought about the stain still drying on my jacket sleeve, the sticky reminder of my place in their design. No, this wasn't petty. Petty would have been a scene, standing up mid-toast, announcing the amount I'd paid, shoving the receipt in someone's hand for all the guests to see. Petty would have been cutting through the music with bitterness and accusation. This was different. This was precise. It was truth, stripped of anger, sent not to humiliate, but to remind. The bass from the dance floor thudded through the carpet under my feet, and somewhere in the swirl of lights and music, my sister was dancing, her hand in her husband's, their smiles broad for the photographer. I wondered if she'd still be smiling when her phone buzzed with my message. Maybe not tonight, but soon. And when she read it, there would be no debating its contents, no room for twisting it into something else. My thumb hovered for just a second longer, and in that breath of hesitation, I realized something. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to admit the slight or justify her choices. This wasn't about hearing her say she was wrong. This was about reclaiming my place in a story they had tried to write me out of. I pressed send. The screen blinked. The message gone, carried into a network of wires and signals that would deliver it to her pocket in seconds. The act was small, invisible to everyone in the room. No one turned their head. No one noticed the shift. But I felt it. A subtle release, a quiet tightening of the ground under my feet. Justice, I decided, didn't always need an audience. It didn't need applause or witnesses. Sometimes it was as simple as a clean line of numbers, a due date, and the undeniable truth that debts, no matter how carefully ignored, have a way of finding their way back to the surface. I slipped the phone into my pocket, sat back in my chair, and let the music roll over me. For the first time all evening, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't need their table, their toast, or their acknowledgement to confirm my worth. The message had been sent. The balance had begun to shift. And whether they realized it tonight or tomorrow, the truth was already on its way. 3 days passed, and the silence was its own kind of answer. No call, no text, not a single word from my sister. The world around me moved on in its usual rhythm. Mornings came, evenings went, but the space where her voice might have been stayed hollow. I checked my phone more often than I wanted to admit, not because I expected gratitude anymore, but because I wanted to see how they would handle the truth once it had landed in their hands. When the response finally came, it wasn't from her at all. It arrived through the groom's email, addressed to me without even the courtesy of my name in the greeting. The message was short, almost casual in its dismissal. "We thought you were giving that as a gift." I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because something in me needed to make sure I had seen the words exactly as they were written. A gift. That was their answer. Not an acknowledgement of what I'd done, not a discussion about the promise that I'd be taken care of, not even a question about the amount. Just the assertion that my act of stepping in to save their wedding menu had been, in their minds, an unspoken donation, one they were entitled to accept without thanks, without mention, without so much as a seat at the table. A strange calm settled over me as I stared at the screen. It wasn't the sharp sting of anger I might have expected. It was heavier than that, deeper, like the final settling of a stone into place after you've carried it too long. Their words didn't surprise me, not really. They only confirmed what the wedding had already made clear. In their version of family, generosity was not something to honor. It was something to consume and forget. I closed the email and sat there for a long time, letting the quiet of my apartment fill in the space where conversation might have been. There was no urge to write back immediately, no need to explain or defend. They had told me everything I needed to know in one sentence, and in that clarity, I understood that this was no longer about money. It was about the way people show you, through choices, through silences, through the smallest of sentences, exactly where you stand in their lives. The thing about silence is that it doesn't just leave a gap. It echoes. It forces you to hear the truth in a way words sometimes can't. And as the third night closed in, I realized I didn't want an apology anymore. I didn't even want repayment for the sake of the money. What I wanted was to make sure they never forgot that debts, both spoken and unspoken, have weight, and this one had just shifted back onto their shoulders. I didn't answer right away. I let their message sit there for a few hours, untouched, while I went about my day in deliberate silence. I wanted them to feel the weight, the same way they had made me feel it, that quiet weight that presses against your thoughts no matter what else you're doing. When I finally sat down to respond, I knew I wasn't going to waste a single word. This wasn't a conversation. It was a statement. I opened a new reply and typed slowly, each letter deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. A gift is wrapped. This was a bill. I paused for a moment, reading those 2 sentences over, feeling the clean edge in them. There was no softness, no cushioning to make it more palatable. I wanted it to be undeniable, impossible to twist into something it wasn't. Then I added the final line. "Please see attached proof." I attached the original receipt from the catering company, the same one I had looked at in the foyer that night. My name, the date, the amount, the official paid in full stamp. I knew there was no room for argument against it. Numbers don't bend to sentiment, and paper doesn't care about pride. I didn't explain the timing. I didn't mention the wedding or the seating chart or the way they'd cut me out of every moment that might have shown I mattered. I didn't need to. Those things weren't the point of this message. The debt was, and the debt spoke for itself. When I pressed send, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I might have expected. Instead, there was a quiet settling inside me, like something heavy had finally been set down in the exact place it belonged. My words had been honed to a point, and now they were out in the world, moving toward their target with nothing to blunt their impact. I imagined them reading it, my sister's face tightening as the reality of my message sank in, the groom leaning over her shoulder to see the numbers for himself. There would be no debate, no way to pretend they didn't understand. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time since the night of the wedding, they'd feel that sharp awareness of how much they had taken, how neatly they had erased the person who had made part of their day possible. I set my phone down and didn't check it again for the rest of the day. I didn't need to. I knew my reply would land exactly as I intended. Not with noise or spectacle, but with the clean, undeniable weight of truth. And sometimes truth is the sharpest blade you can draw. That night, long after the streets had gone quiet and the world outside my window had sunk into darkness, my phone lit up with her name. For a moment I considered letting it ring. I thought about the months of silence before the wedding, the hurried thank yous that never came, the deliberate distance she had put between us that night as though I might stain her perfect picture. But curiosity, or maybe closure, made me swipe to answer. Her voice was different, smaller, stripped of its usual brightness, as if the words she was about to speak were heavier than she wanted to carry. There was no preamble, no attempt at small talk, just a pause on the line, followed by 4 clipped words. "We'll pay you back." No apology for the seat in the corner, no mention of the paper napkin or the plastic cup. No acknowledgement of the whispers I'd seen pass between her and her husband while I sat invisible at the edge of the room. Just obligation. Just the transaction. And to my own surprise, I was fine with that. Because I realized, as I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, that this wasn't about repairing the relationship anymore. I didn't need her remorse, didn't crave her explanation. I didn't even need her to admit she had been wrong. All I needed was for the debt to change hands, for the weight of it to move from me back to her, where it belonged. She could dress it in whatever justification helped her sleep at night. She could call it repayment, or formality, or a misunderstanding cleared up. It didn't matter. There was a strange power in knowing I had stripped this moment of emotion on my side. She might have expected me to lash out, to demand an apology, to let my voice rise with all the hurt I had been carrying. But I kept it even. I told her I'd send over the account details. My tone was calm, almost businesslike, and I could feel the subtle shift in the air between us, the reversal of the unspoken hierarchy she'd been guarding so tightly. She was no longer speaking from the center of her perfect celebration. She was speaking from a place of owing, of having been called to account. And I didn't need her to like it. I only needed her to feel it. When I hung up, I didn't feel lighter in the way people talk about after resolving a conflict. This wasn't resolution. This was realignment. The scales had begun to tip back into balance, and I could live with that. I didn't look back at my phone to see if she texted anything else. I didn't wait for a follow-up. That night, for the first time since the wedding, I felt the faint hum of control return. Not because I had forced her to see my worth, but because I no longer needed her to. The payment came through 2 days later. A small vibration on my phone announcing its arrival. I opened the banking app without ceremony, though a part of me lingered on the irony. This number, so clinical and detached on the screen, was the same figure that had once been the lifeline to their carefully planned celebration. Now it was coming back to me, stripped of all the fanfare, no handwritten note, no call to say thank you, just a transfer, to the cent. I stared at it for a long moment, not out of surprise, but because the transaction felt heavier than the money itself. It was proof that they had received my message exactly as I'd intended it. Clear, irrefutable, impossible to sidestep. And yet, it also carried a kind of finality. This was the closing of a ledger, the sealing of a chapter in a book I would never reopen the same way. I tapped the screen, moving the payment into my savings account. But I didn't leave it nameless. I gave it a label, the Kids' Table Fund. The words almost made me smile, not out of humor, but out of the clarity they carried. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about choice. This money wasn't just returned to me. It was a reminder that from now on, I would decide where I sat, both in rooms and in lives. The memory of that corner table flashed in my mind. The paper napkin folded without care, the crayon basket tipped sideways, the sticky sleeve of my jacket cooling against my skin. I could still hear the laughter across the room, that bright, insular sound that had never been meant for me. For the first time, it didn't sting. It felt distant, like something that belonged firmly in the past, a place I had already chosen not to return to. I thought about how many times I had taken a seat someone else had assigned me, trusting that they knew my worth, that they would see me without having to be reminded. Too many, I realized, and every time I had done it, I had quietly agreed to their version of the story. Not anymore. As I set the phone down, I felt a stillness in the room, not empty but clean, like air after a storm. This wasn't triumph in the traditional sense. There was no parade, no applause, no dramatic confrontation to replay in my mind. But it was something better, the calm certainty that I had taken back what was mine, and with it the power to choose my place. The money sat there now, a quiet symbol, not of what they had taken, but of what I had reclaimed. And I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that no matter where life set the table next time, I would be the one deciding where my chair went. Months later, when winter had loosened its grip and the air felt warmer against the skin, I decided it was time to host something of my own. Not a grand celebration, not an event meant to rival anyone's wedding, just a dinner, something honest, something mine. I chose a small restaurant tucked away from the main streets, a place where the tables were round and the lighting was soft, where conversation could rise and fall without being drowned out by music. When the guests arrived, friends, a few relatives, people who had stood beside me when it mattered, I made sure of one thing: no head of the table, no place of honor set apart from the rest. Just a single wide circle where every chair had the same weight, the same view, the same distance to the center. The food came out slowly, in generous dishes meant for sharing, no plated separations to mark who was important and who wasn't. Laughter moved easily around the table, passing from one person to the next without getting stuck in one corner. At some point during the evening, someone asked why I'd chosen a round table. I could have given the long version, told them about the kids' table, the paper napkin, the silence that had hung between me and my sister, the way money had replaced acknowledgement. I could have explained the Kids' Table Fund and the lesson it carried, but I didn't. I just smiled, letting my gaze rest on the circle of faces, each one lit with the same glow from the overhead lamps, none higher or lower than the others. The truth was simple, and I spoke it without raising my voice. If you don't have a seat at their table, build your own. I let the words hang there for a moment, then added quietly, and make sure the bill has your name on it. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving them wrong or showing them what they'd lost. It was about claiming my space, shaping it the way I believed it should be, and filling it with people who didn't need to be reminded that everyone at the table mattered. I didn't care if anyone remembered what had happened months ago. The ones who were here tonight didn't need to be taught the lesson. They already lived it. As the evening wound down and the plates sat empty between us, I looked around the circle and felt something I hadn't felt the night of the wedding: belonging. Not because someone else had granted it to me, but because I had built it with my own hands. And in that moment, I knew the best seat in any room is the one you create for yourself.